All right, great. And also put on the closed caption as well. All right, good morning, everybody. I hope everyone is having a wonderful time this morning. Welcome to the Black History Nerds. We're just some nerds learning about Black history on Saturday morning. And I'm your HNIC, your head nerd in charge. And I'm glad to see everybody coming in. Montana, have you watched the movie I told you to watch? Because you don't know the HNIC reference.
I haven't yet.
Lean on me. Watch Lean on Me when you have some time. While you're entering here, please introduce yourself and where you're at.
Joanne Smith, Buffalo, New York.
Buffalo's in the house. Hey, everybody put it in the chat, please.
Barbara Ann Fields from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Philly.
Go Eagles.
Go ahead in your chat. Introduce yourselves, where you're from. I don't even have a question for today, so I'll go back to old school and ask you, when did you fall in love with Black history? When did you fall in love with Black history? We'll take a few minutes here, and we'll get started in just a little bit. Good morning, everyone. Do we have everybody in? Let's see.
Hi, everybody. I can't hear it, Dr. King.
You can't hear at all? What about anybody else?
I can hear.
Okay.
Cannot hear.
Okay, hold on, let's see.
Is it quiet now, or are we supposed to be hearing something?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
I can hear you.
Oh, you can't hear the music?
Right.
Okay, all right, well, we'll go ahead and get started because it's 11:05. Welcome, everybody, to February 11th, Black History Nerds. And of course, I am LeGarrette King, and we are here to hear the wonderful Dr. Amanda Vickery today. And I hope everyone is doing well. If you just got in, please introduce yourself in the chat, as well as answer today's question is, when did you fall in love with Black history? Again, this is Black History Month, and from the Center for K-12 Black History Education, I want to say Happy Black History Month. I hope you all are engaging in all different forms of activities around this year's topic, which is resistance, from the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. And there has been some excellent Black History Month events going on all around the country, both in person as well as online. And we hope that you are engaging in those particular aspects, especially the Black History nerds. I'd just like to remind everybody that our Teaching Black History Conference is July 21st through the 23rd here in Buffalo, New York. So if you are interested in submitting a proposal to possibly present, Donovan in a little bit will, put the website where you can put your proposal in, so you can go ahead and submit a proposal to present at our conference. Deadline is March 4th. Registration will be opening up very soon, so feel free to register. As soon as I get the go-ahead from the University of Buffalo, we'll start our registration period. Our resource for this week will be Black Lives Matter at School, an uprising for educational justice. Haymark Books just advertised that they are giving out the ebook for free. Okay, all right. So if you go on the Haymark website, as well as I'll have Donovan put the Haymark link in the chat, so you can go ahead and click on that link and you can have the book for free. Okay, it is an ebook, but it'll be free for you all to enjoy. Next week, our head nerd facilitator next week is Miss Brittany Jones from Michigan State, and her topic will be why aren't Black people allowed to fear in U.S. history? So please sign up for that session for next week. And but without further ado, you all didn't hear me the talk this morning. We have Dr. Amanda Vickery, who will talk a little bit today on Hands That Pick Cotton Now Pick Public Officials, Black Women's Geography and Activism of Fannie Lou Hamer. So let's welcome Dr. Vickery to our nerd session.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome, and for starting with one of my favorite songs, Diamonds and Pearls by Prince. We didn't get to hear it, but that's okay. We got to see the video, which is just very, very 90s, and I just love it. All right, let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, can everyone see my screen? Maybe give me a thumbs up.
Yes.
All right, cool. All right. Well, again, just good morning. Thank you so much for inviting me to share virtual space with you this morning. So my name is Amanda Vickery. I'm an associate professor of social studies and anti-racist education at the University of North Texas. So again, thank you to Dr. King and everyone at the center for the invitation to speak this morning on some work that this is a kind of a new line of research for me. So I'm really excited to share it with y'all. And I'm just so grateful for the important work that the center is doing to promote the teaching of Black history and racial literacy in K-12 schools. So here's the agenda for our time together this morning. And I do apologize in advance. My 2-year-old has shared his cough with me. So I will probably be, I'm trying not to cough, but I have got my tea, I've got my water. So it's all going to be good. So first, I'll kind of start with an introduction, then I'll kind of get into talking about geography the way that it's traditionally taught. And then we'll get into talking about Fannie Lou Hamer and her life and activism. And then we'll definitely end hopefully with some time for some Q&A. Okay, let's get started. But before we get into the talk today, I do think it's important for us to begin with a land and labor acknowledgement, both because land and labor are really important parts of our story as African ascendant people. So I acknowledge that I am living on indigenous lands of Turtle Island and the ancestral name for what is now North America. And so I'm speaking with you from my home in Denton, Texas. And so I want to honor and pay my respects to the Wichita and the affiliated tribes in the Caddo Nation and all the American Indian, Indigenous people and communities who have been or have become a part of these lands and territories in Texas, because this is sacred ground. And so as social studies teachers, many of us are oftentimes complicit in erasure. And so it's really important for us to recognize, support, and advocate for the sovereignty of Native nations, Indigenous people across Turtle Island and throughout the Fourth World. And so we also want to honor, lift up, affirm, and celebrate Black bodies. So many parts of the United States were built by enslaved Africans and their descendants. And so today, Black individuals and people of color disproportionately work as service staff and essential workers across the country. And so this is a community that's largely responsible for the maintenance of our daily lives. So food services, childcare, healthcare, elderly care, many other basic necessities that provide us comfort. And so I make this acknowledgement, not out of some sense of propriety or political correctness, but really to hold ourselves as researchers, teachers, and settlers accountable. So land and labor acknowledgements, they're just a small step towards unlearning the stories and practices that erase and dehumanize BIPOC story histories and their contributions to our society. And so in an effort to move this acknowledgement beyond these few words, I will offer some resources for educators and researchers to learn more about Black histories, in particular, Black women's histories with the land later on in this presentation. So I think it's important to speak a little bit about kind of who I am, but really what brings me to this work, what grounds me. So I am an unapologetic Black, biracial, feminist, mother, wife, yogi, and Beyonce hype girl. I'm a former middle school history teacher, but I currently work at the University of North Texas, where I have the pleasure of working with brilliant pre-service elementary teachers and helping and supporting them in finding ways to teach and advocate for social studies. I also conduct research on understanding the concept of citizenship and how Black women teachers define it and teach it. I also examine the ways in which we can highlight Black women's civic activism within the US history curriculum. And so I do want to acknowledge that being a social studies teacher at this moment is really hard. It's physically and emotionally draining with all of the recent attacks on the teaching of African American studies, critical race theory by people who don't even know what it means. I mean, there's book bans in schools, violence towards BIPOC and LGBTQ individuals and communities, the foolishness of the Supreme Court coming after affirmative action and overturning Roe v. Wade, not to mention the gun violence in our schools and communities. And so this is hard. It's hard work that we're doing. And it's hard to teach about difficult histories, current events, and any topic related to race, racism, identity, where it feels that many of us are under attack. Not just the way that we teach or what we teach, but who we are, who we love, our bodily autonomy are all under attack. And so I think it's important to remember, for us to remember what brings us to this work. So one thing you'll learn about me really quickly, besides my obsession with Beyonce, and no, I don't have tickets to her concert yet. I'm hoping my husband, like I've been sending him vibes like that would be a great Valentine's Day gift. So I'm hoping that they work out. But one thing you'll learn about me is that I love history and I love studying the past. And I really think that you can learn more about yourself in the present day by looking at the past. So James Baldwin's famous quote, and I know I'm going to butcher it. We carry our history with us. We're unconsciously controlled by it. And that history is literally present in all that we do. That's kind of like my motto, my mantra for when I'm teaching. And as a teacher, I heard so many students of all ages who tell me that they hate history. And it hurts a little bit every time I hear it. But I know it's because people have been exposed to a K through 12 curriculum that wasn't relevant to their lives, where they couldn't see themselves in their ancestors reflected. And so, or they experience what my good friend, Dr. King, has written about, so the educative psychic violence, and they've experienced harm and trauma because of the social studies, the history curriculum. And so my job is to try to create a healing and affirming space for pre-service teachers, for them to learn about the past, and to use it as a way to learn more about who they are and where we can go in the present day. And so I do this work because that's what I needed when I was a student. And so I have a 2-year-old son. His name is Theodore. I have his picture on the screen. He's just such a joyful young boy. And I don't want him to experience the social studies that I had when I was young, where I didn't learn about my ancestors. I want him to experience a social studies curriculum where he will learn about incredible activists like Ella Baker, Grace Lee Boggs, Angela Davis, Dolores Huerta, William Mankiller, Polly Murray, people whose work span generations and whose names rarely make headlines. And so the work begins with the curriculum and the work that we do as teachers. And so I do this work, you know, because of my son, for my son, in the hopes of creating a better world. And so that's what grounds me and brings me to this work. So let's get into it. So I want to begin going back in January of 1865. So after General William Tecumseh Sherman's army arrived in Savannah, Georgia towards the end of the Civil War, the Secretary of War at the time, Edwin Stanton, joined Sherman at a meeting with representatives of Savannah's Black community. And the Black community chose Garrison Frazier, a minister who was formerly enslaved, to represent their views before Sherman and Stanton. And so they asked the minister, what is it that Black people needed? And according to transcripts from the meeting, Frazier reportedly told them, the best way we can take care of ourselves is to have land and to turn it and till it by our labor. That is by the labor of the women and children and old men. And we can soon maintain ourselves and have something to spare. We want to be placed on land until we are able to buy it and make it our own. And so Sherman turned this request for land into Special Order 15. So where the government took land seized by the Confederacy and divided it up between thousands of newly emancipated people. My middle school students used to refer to this as 40 acres and a mule. And according to Monica White, in 1875, African Americans owned 3 million acres of land. 5 years later, they owned 8 million. And by 1900, it was about 12 million acres. So during Reconstruction, and even after the time after that, Black Americans were not only reuniting with families and family members, but planting roots and purchasing land of their own and working it. And by the 1920s, Black people owned about 1 million farms. So 14% of all farms in this country. This is despite laws and systems working against them. They had accumulated some 15 million acres by, like I said, the 1920s. But this number has dwindled. Land has been taken, sold illegally, or deviously schemed from Black property owners. And so in the decades that followed, that number had dropped from 14% of all farms in the US being Black owned to below 2%. And so between 1910 and 1997, Black Americans had lost, according to Monica White, about 90% of their farmland. And so the African principle of Sankofa states that we have to really study the past in order to understand the present and to forge a future of our own making. And so I start with this history of land loss because, yes, we have to teach and speak about the terror, loss, and hardships of when we're talking about Black farmers, because that is part of our story. But as Monica White wrote, the oppression of slavery, land tenancy, and sharecropping is but one part of the story. So we need to make sure that we broaden the story of the history of Black farmers and their connections with the land and the ways in which Black Americans have shaped the geography of this place. And so Hinton and Robinson noted that in 1619, when Africans were brought to British North America in chains as part of the transatlantic slave trade, they carried with them unique gifts and a wealth of knowledge that greatly contributed to the economic growth and development and prosperity of North America. And so just kind of a shout out, because I work with elementary teachers, the ABCs of Black History by Rio Cortez. This is a book that my son and I both love to read. I love that there's a page in here that notes about the contributions of Black Americans to the land. So F is for food grown and farmed with our hands, worked and tilled and pulled from the land. And so African foods and spices and agricultural techniques all help shape this country. So culturally, economically, and geographically. And so I love about, so Catherine McKittrick, and I'm going to talk about her work and more in just a little bit. She has been helping us to rethink how we see Black Americans and how they have been integral to production of space. And that social practices create landscapes and contribute to how we organize and imagine our surroundings. So in her book, she writes that Black subjects are geographic beings, which counters this representation of Black Americans in the social studies curriculum. So taking a step back and thinking about the field of geography and the way it's taught and thought about in K through 12 schools. So geography is often a subject that encompasses learning about the physical features of the earth, as well as, you know, human interactions with the environment. But that's a very kind of simplistic way of thinking about this subject. So often we learn about geography, it is divorced from our lives and our experiences. So very much this kind of like positivist paradigm, it's this idea of objectivity and that knowledge is out there to be discovered. And so McKittrick, she wrote this fabulous book called Demonic Grounds, Black Women and the Cartographies of Struggle. And so she says the problem with this traditional approach to geography is that it purports that we can view, assess, and ethically organize the world from this white, patriarchal, Eurocentric, heterosexual, classed vantage point. So the lens in which we understand and view the geography is from this white Western perspective. And the problem is that it doesn't take into account, in particular looking at Catherine McKittrick's work, the ways in which Black women are negotiating a geographic landscape that is upheld by a legacy of exploitation and conquest. So this very traditional white masculine Western lens of geography represents a different sense of place and erases subaltern ways of being, knowing stories in the land. And so McKittrick argues that geography as we know it has always been about knowledge and whose knowledge is taught. And that geography has always been connected to power and colonialism and violence and conquest. And so when we think about geography, we also have to examine the ways in which violence operates in geography. And so one way violence operates is through these discourses of ownership. So having and possessing things, whether it's owning land, invading territories, the idea of possessing human beings, all of these narratives of displacement are forms of conquest. And so as social studies teachers, we really need to help our students understand the connections between geographies of domination and Black women's geographies and strive to make visible lives that are often displaced and rendered ungeographic. And so McKittrick's research in this lovely book really helps us understand how Black women's histories and our lives and the spaces in which we inhabit enmesh with traditional geographic arrangements and creates a very different way of existing in the social world. So that's kind of this like theoretical way of thinking about it. So let's think about what does this actually mean and how we think about geography in the classroom. So we really need to move away from this idea of teaching geography that it's stringent, unmovable, and unwavering. And I love Alan used this term critical geography, and it's a framework, a lens for us to think about geography and to teach it in a way that shows the interrelationships between space, place, power, and identity. So when teaching about the notion of space, teach students that geography doesn't exist without what we bring to it. So we produce space, we bring meaning to it, but also it is also a means of power and control. So space can exist in a real physical form, but also be virtual. So thinking about like cyberspace. Oh, let me go back. All right, so let me go. Sorry, my cat is playing with my mouse right now. She just sat on top of it. And so place identity, that's kind of what I want to focus on. Who we are is framed in the everyday things that we do. So our routines and activities in which we engage. So the spaces we occupy are sites where we try to represent ourselves as certain types of people. So like in certain spaces, certain identities come to the forefront, and in other spaces, other identities surface. So like we know as teachers, students assume one identity in the classroom, but then when they leave your classroom and they go in the hallway, you see a completely different side of your students. And they are, you know, very different at home or in the streets with their friends. So our place has an impact on who we are. And the meaning of place evolved, and we have the ability to change it and also be changed by it. And so, like I said, in this presentation, I want to dig deeper into this idea of place identity and how Fannie Lou Hamer's activism was shaped by place. And so bell hooks theorized this idea of a home place as a space of care and nurturance in the face of harsh reality of racism and sexism. So she argues that home place is a site where one could exist freely and a place where you can resist. So Hooks argued that Black women resisted by making homes where all Black people could strive to be subjects, not objects, where we could be affirmed in our minds and hearts despite poverty, hardships, deprivation, where we could restore to ourselves the dignity denied us on the outside in the public world. And so this idea of a home place is a safe space created and nurtured by Black women where Black people could affirm one another and be their true selves and heal the many wounds inflicted by white supremacy and colonialism. So home place as this community of resistance. And so I want to explore how these concepts of Black feminist geography, place identity, and home place showed up in Fannie Lou Hamer's life and fueled and shaped her activism. And so just a little bit of a background on Fannie Lou Hamer. She was born in Mississippi in 1917. She was the youngest of 20 children. She was the granddaughter of enslaved people, and for most of her life, she worked as a sharecropper in rural Mississippi. And so sharecropping in Mississippi, it has been argued, resembled the rhythms of slavery, working sun up to sundown, picking cotton on a slave labor camp, working to enrich white landowners as your family sunk deeper and deeper into debt. And so at the age of 42, she attended a mass meeting at a local church where she met SNCC activists. And it was at that meeting where she first learned that, she had a right to vote, and that forever changed the course of her life. And so she was fired from her job on the plantation for attempting to register to vote. And she described it as a blessing in disguise. She said, when they kicked me off the plantation, they set me free. It's the best thing that could happen. Now I can work for my people. And so she threw herself full force into her activism, trying to register Black Americans to vote, participating in leading marches and sit-ins. But she was also the target of violence, harassment. She was sexually assaulted, intimidated by law enforcement. She was arrested, brutally beaten, assaulted while in police custody, and left with permanent scars and physically disabled, but it didn't deter her. And so although Ms. Hamer's activism on securing citizenship and voting rights for Black Americans in the 1960s, she understood that there were many in her hometown that not only were prevented from voting through laws and intimidation, but they were also food insecure. And so she knew that securing the right to vote wouldn't mean a thing unless Black Americans could afford food and were economically self-sufficient. And so that included land. And so she once said that in order for any people or nation to survive, land is necessary. And so the knowledge and experiences that she gained living and existing as a Black woman sharecropper in the Mississippi Delta shaped her identity. So place is shaping her identity. And so Hamer was dedicated to ending human suffering in the Mississippi Delta by creating a community of resistance. She wanted to create a home place. And that was in the form of the Freedom Farm. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But for centuries, Black women have spoken and written about the realities of living and existing in a racist and very patriarchal society. So going back to the Combahee River Collective from the 1970s, they talked about Black women's experiences on the margin being a life and death struggle for survival and liberation. But in the process, they've created space for a more viable democracy. And so Catherine McKittrick argues that Black women are both shaped by and challenge traditional geographic arrangements. But Black women's geographies have been rendered absent in larger conversations about geography because there's this history of Black women's bodies and minds being relegated outside of the margins of knowledge and imagined outside of the production of space. And so by using a Black feminist geographic lens, we can understand that for Black women, racism and sexism were not just bodily or identity based, but they are also spatial acts as well. And so they also have the power to challenge such arrangements by sharing our knowledge and experiences on our own term. And so I'm going to kind of highlight how Fannie Lou Hamer was a cartographer, and she used her voice and her story to map out Black women's geographies and how she had been shaped by the land. And also how those in positions of power engage in geographies of conquest to maintain the racial hierarchy. But Fannie Lou Hamer resisted these unequal spatial arrangements by creating this home place in the Mississippi Delta through the Freedom Farm Collective as a place where Black farmers could exist freely with dignity. And so one of my favorite picture books is Voice of Freedom, Fannie Lou Hamer, Spirit of the Civil Rights Movement by Carol Boston Weatherford, and illustrated by Eku Holmes. And I think this is a lovely book that can be used with both upper elementary, but also middle school students. I was a middle school teacher. My students loved when I would bust out picture books and it would be story time. And so this is a great book that I would definitely recommend you could use in both elementary and secondary spaces. And I love that this book could also be easily paired with primary sources. And I think Carol Boston Weatherford did a beautiful job of showing how Hamer's life experiences shaped her activism and how the land shaped her identity and call towards activism. And so this book begins by tracing Fannie Lou Hamer's roots as the daughter of sharecroppers in the Mississippi Delta. She wrote, where the soil was as rich as Black folks were poor, where cotton was king and Jim Crow the law. And so the development of the sharecropping system was designed to exploit Black Americans and keep them in this perpetual state of slavery. And so sharecropping was a system of farming that bound Black farmers to white landowners, very similar to slavery. And so Henson and Robinson characterized it by being, like I said, borne down in ever-increasing debts, trapped in this legal system which severely restricted their every movement, weakened by malnutrition and disease, and violently denied access to legal relief. Black tenant farmers and sharecroppers labored under a weight of oppression which offered virtually no escape. And so Fannie Lou Hamer, she often spoke about how hard life was as a sharecropper for her and her family. In an oral history interview in 1973, she said that life was hard and we never hardly had enough to eat. We didn't have clothes to wear. We had to work real hard because I started working when I was about 6 years old. And then throughout her interviews and public speeches in her civil rights activism, she often revisited her upbringing in the Jim Crow South. She told one story that showed how even as a child, that even children would be used to uphold the white supremacist economic and geographic system. So she said, I remember, and I will never forget, one day I was 6 years old and I was playing beside the road, and this plantation owner drove up to me and stopped and asked me, could I pick some cotton? I told him, I don't know. And he said, yes, you can. I will give you things that you want from the commissary store. And he named things like Cracker Jacks and sardines, and it was a huge list that he called off. So I picked the 30 pounds of cotton that week, but I found out what actually happened was he was trapping me into beginning the work I was to keep doing. And I never did get out of his debt again. And so Keisha Blaine is a brilliant historian, and she argued that this particular incident showed the great lengths that white landowners went to maintain and grow their wealth and preserve white supremacy. And so this system of sharecropping designed by white landowners created, again, this unending dependency, debt peonage for Black Americans with little prospect of land ownership or accumulation of wealth. And as a child, Fannie Lou Hamer watched her family worked hard year after year in this unjust system. So it's seen from Weatherford's Boston's picture book details that even when her parents had saved up enough money to purchase livestock and farm equipment, a white neighbor poisoned the livestock. So she said, once my father managed to buy a wagon, plow, 3 mules, Ella, Bird, and Henry, and 2 cows, Mullen and Della. But a white neighbor poisoned the livestock, just couldn't stand to see Black people getting ahead. That knocked us right back down to doggone dirt poor doing without. My parents never did get a chance to get up again. I sure did miss Della's milk. But despite the hardships of living life as a sharecropper, Fannie Lou Hamer's family was a site of love and support and wisdom that would have an important impact on her activism. So she talks about these struggles, but also about the love and the agency and the resistance and resilience of her family. So her father, James, was a sharecropper, but he also picked up odd jobs to support the family to make ends meet. He was also a Baptist minister who had a great impact on Fannie Lou Hamer's faith. Her mother, Luella, taught her a great deal about Black pride and how to live a life of courage and dignity. In a speech, Fannie Lou Hamer told the crowd, so my mother told me, number one, she wanted me to remember to respect myself as a Black child. And as I got older, she told me to respect myself as a Black woman. And she said, maybe you don't understand what I'm talking about now, but one day if you respect yourself and other people will have to respect you. And so Hamer recounted a time when one of her white supervisors raised a fist to strike one of Hamer's brothers, but Luella stepped in and grabbed the overseer's arm. And she made it very clear to that overseer that they were not to touch her children. And so this was an extremely bold act of defiance, one in which Luella could have been killed. But that showed Fannie Lou Hamer the importance of being willing to place your life in danger to protect those you love, the importance of Black love, self-respect, and defending your principles no matter the cost. And so Fannie Lou Hamer has this long history of resisting, guided by her mother's example. Because she could read and write, the plantation owner where she worked promoted her to a timekeeper to keep record of cotton production. And so in this position, she realized that white landowners were exploiting the Black sharecroppers. And so she resisted and used her position to help others by weighing the cotton fairly. So what the white landowners would do is they had this special scale that they would tell the timekeepers to use, and it would skew the actual weight of it. And so Fannie Lou Hamer found out about that. And so what she did instead was, instead of using their rigged scale, she used an accurate one to make sure that the Black farmers were getting a fair deal. And so she was willing to take personal risks to help others. And then after attending a SNCC meeting, she threw herself into fighting for full citizenship for Black Americans. So she once said, we are tired of being mistreated. We are tired of dying for nothing. And God wants us to take a stand. And the only way that we can change the system in the state of Mississippi is by going to the courthouse, registering to vote, but you got to stand up. Freedom is not something that's put in your lap. You will have to go to the courthouse and say, I want to register. This is a protest to show them, and I am not satisfied. And so Keisha Bland wrote that Black residents in the Mississippi during the 1960s suffered from not only extreme unemployment and homelessness, but also hunger and malnutrition. And the state failed to intervene and offer any kind of aid to Black Americans in Mississippi. In fact, the white politicians and leaders did everything to block Black Americans from receiving any kind of government assistance or support. And the problem was intentionally created by white supremacists. And again, they did everything that they could to keep Black Americans as second-class citizens in this subordinate position and always in financial need and, you know, relying on this quote unquote benevolent white person. And so Fannie Lou Hamer dedicated her life to changing that. She said that, you know, we have to build our own power, and that I had been going around a lot of areas and seeing folks not just having enough to get food stamps. We just thought if we had land to grow stuff on, that it would be a help to us. And so in 1967, the Freedom Farm Cooperative, known as the FFC, was officially formed as an anti-poverty strategy to help poor unemployed farm workers in rural Mississippi. And so the FFC grew to over 640 acres, I believe over a 10-year time period, and provided a critical means for local farmers to have some sense of financial independence and also, you know, political autonomy and dignity. And so there were four main parts to the Freedom Farm Cooperative. So the first was developing an agricultural cooperative that would meet the food and nutritional needs of Sunflower County in Mississippi, which is Fannie Lou Hamer's hometown. Another function of the FFC was to purchase land so that farmers could raise fresh vegetables such as soybean, corn, sweet potatoes, and a little bit of cotton. When it was time to harvest the crop, some of the crop would be given to the families in need and the rest would be canned and preserved. And this was important because the farm provided food to countless families who were in dire need of sustenance. And so in an estimated about 10% of the crops grown at the farm went to local residents who could not work in the fields. And so in the 1970s, the surplus was also shipped to Black families from Mississippi who had relocated to northern cities as part of the Great Migration. And so the second part of the FFC was to provide affordable housing to families on the Delta. So not only did the farmers and local contractors help build affordable housing for families, but they also taught families how to acquire low-cost FHA and farm mortgages that had historically been made available to Black farmers and families due to the discrimination built into the FHA system. And so the third part of the FFC was to provide resources and support for small business owners with agricultural knowledge. And the last part was education. So inspired by her own experiences, so Fannie Lou Hamer had been ripped away from formal schooling, I think by the time she was about in the 6th grade. The cooperative worked to help uplift the Black community. And so FFC developed several scholarships to help local Black youth attend college. Fannie Lou Hamer was instrumental in getting Head Start to come to Sunflower County. And then the FFC also launched the Fannie Lou Hamer Daycare Center in the early 1970s. And so not only did they provide education to, you know, and resources to the community, but they also organized landowners and participated in political education to educate Black rural residents about their rights as citizens and getting them to vote. And so June Jordan, the famous writer, once traveled to Mississippi and wrote a story on Mississippi for the New York Times in October of 1970. And so she included a bit about the Freedom Farm and what it represented. And so Fannie Lou Hamer told June Jordan, you see, this means you got your milk and you got your vegetables, your meat, and then you got your living. And that's the only way to survive in Mississippi if you control your own life. And so the Freedom Farm, you know, this vision that Fannie Lou Hamer had for her community was an opportunity for Black self-sufficiency and Black people having control over their own life and not always being at the mercy of these white landowners. And so the Freedom Farm showed the possibilities of Black economic, geographic, and political power. And also the FFC provided Black families with the opportunity to assert their dignity as human beings. The Freedom Farm got their money from a lot of different organizations, nonprofits, and one of their funding sources was the National Council for Negro Women. And so in a report from the National Council for Negro Women in 1968, they reported that the FFC provided its members with the opportunity to have a stake in it. They are not relying on handouts, they are enhancing their own dignity and freedom by learning that they can feed themselves through their own effort. So that you keep hearing this idea of this notion of asserting their dignity, their worth, their personhood. And so this was a model for community uplift and activism that provided Black farmers with the ability to become economically self-sufficient while growing their community. And so a guiding principle behind the Freedom Farm was to create these long-lasting sustainable changes by empowering local Black farmers to work together and gain this sense of dignity and self-worth as first-class citizens. And so Hamer created this home space, a space where Black farmers could affirm one another and be their true selves and heal the many wounds inflicted to them by being in this very racist society. And so in Carol Boston Weatherford's book, I think she beautifully summed up kind of Fannie Lou Hamer's model of activism. It's very much rooted in the community, inspired by her upbringing to create change and uplift one another. And so in the book, Carol Boston Weatherford writes, "I had always believed we serve God by serving our fellow man, and no child should know what hunger is. So I started a Freedom Farm, a pig bank, and a Head Start program, and I help folks living in shacks get hold of government housing loans. I mined a lot of pots. I given my 2 cents to the women's liberation movement. I won a lawsuit against Sunflower County to integrate the public schools, and I lost a bid for state senate in 1971. The outcome was rigged against me, but 55 Blacks was elected in Mississippi that year, a record for a Southern state." Excuse me. In 1976, the Congressional Black Caucus, made up of Black congresspeople, given me a lifelong service award. Maybe I had won after all. And so by the 1970s, Fannie Lou Hamer's health was rapidly in decline. So fatigue, aches and pains, she had untreated type 2 diabetes, not to mention the grueling and physical toll white supremacy and racism had took on her body. Combined with her activism, she had very rigorous public speaking tours, working to raise money for her civil rights causes, but also to keep the Freedom Farm afloat. So all of this took a toll on her mental and physical health. And so Fannie Lou Hamer, she went to be with the Lord on March 14th, 1977. News of her death spread like a wildfire across the country, and people gathered to remember her voice, her spirit, and her unwavering generosity and her commitment to her community. The editor-in-chief of Essence magazine at the time, Marcia Gillespie, wrote a really moving essay on Fannie Lou Hamer's life and legacy. So she wrote that, "I met a woman who defied any little platform or pedestal I might have wished to place her on. I met a woman whose commitment to making this a decent world was total. A woman who lived a life of faith, who reminded me of the power of prayer and hope, who would not belittle herself by hating, who long discovered that her capacity for living was boundless, who gave it freely and easily without fear or rejection or depletion. I met a woman beautiful because she loved, a fighter because of love, and indomitable in her love. She made me want to do better, be bigger, and I basked in her warmth." And so by learning about the life and experiences of Fannie Lou Hamer and the creation of the Freedom Farm, students begin to see the connections between place, land, and place identity, and this idea of belonging. And so this history can teach students a great deal about what Monica White writes about reconnecting with the land as a strategy for self-determination and self-sufficiency. And so if we think about the official US history curriculum and the ways in which Black farmers are taught throughout this official curriculum, they're painted in very deficit ways. They're positioned as either enslaved people picking cotton, or they're in poverty, trapped in the sharecropping system, and that they are treated as permanently indebted to this benevolent white enslaver or landowner. And that's really problematic. And so we really need to, as teachers, paint a broader and fuller portrait of Black farmers, but also Black Americans' ties to the land and the impact they have on space and place. And so this history allows us to honor Black women's geographic knowledge and experiences and how they have sparked, modern day conversations about sustainability, community, farm to table practices, farming cooperatives, environmental justice, and food security. So these are things that we're talking about in the present day, but we need to see their roots as happening, way before that. And so we think about the current state of, thinking about Black farmers today. So I guess it was not too long ago, as part of the $1.9 trillion COVID relief stimulus package that President Biden signed into law, I think it was in 2021, I believe. So $4 to $5 billion was to be set aside to help Black farmers who have endured generations of racial discrimination, documented cases of racial discrimination. And in these agricultural department reports, and we see the legal settlements between the department and Black farmers that shows literally these decades and decades of bias and implementation of New Deal policies, from the 1930s and 40s, and other farm assistance programs that have benefited white farmers and Black farmers didn't have access to. And so the generations of discriminatory practices meant that Black farmers were continually denied opportunities to expand and to modernize their farms. And so this money, these billions of dollars set aside for Black farmers was seen by some as an important step towards, reparations of generations of harm committed against Black farmers that continues to this day. And so Carol Anderson, she's a scholar I think she's at, where is she at? Maybe Emory University. She wrote this brilliant book. It's called White Rage. It's a really great book. I definitely recommend it. But she describes that white rage as for every action of African-American advancement, there's a reaction, a backlash, white rage. And so you best believe that with this stimulus package, there was huge backlash. And so right now, a judge has blocked the debt relief program for Black farmers, calling it unconstitutional. And so the judge acknowledges in their decision that there's a dark history of past discrimination against minority farmers, but then he agrees with the white farmers that this program is discriminating against white farmers and ranchers because of their race. I mean, I just can't make this stuff up. I mean, it's just white rage happening, right there. But, despite this, political activist Karen Washington reminds us that our ancestors built the agricultural system of this country on their backs, and we're not going to let them take it from us. And so the struggle continues. But we have seen in recent years, the number of Black farmers has increased as more and more Black Americans are finding their way back to the land as a way to reconnect with their African roots. And so that's a really beautiful thing to see, that despite this discrimination, we're still finding our way back to the land. And so my interest in this topic is a personal one, I will say. I come from a long line of farmers. So according to family stories, my ancestors received 40 acres after the Civil War, but the original 40 acres were reduced to 20 over the years. And for reasons that are unclear to my family today, my great-grandparents, Frank and Dora Crawford, who are pictured in this photo, they had to purchase back our family land in the early 1900s. And so my mother always spoke so fondly of her memories of this land in Vernon Parish, Louisiana, milking the cows, eating sugarcane, getting water from the well, running amongst the chickens. But it was only recently that the land was sold by a distant relative. And so this loss of family land was and is still very painful for my family. I recently spoke with my uncle who lives in outside of New Orleans about the history of our family land. And my uncle kept saying over and over again, I wish we still had that land. I want that land back. But nevertheless, my family still continued to farm the land. My papa kept a garden alongside the carport. And so I remember we'd visit Louisiana, DeRidder, Louisiana in the summertime, and I would watch him pick these enormous cucumbers and bring them inside the house. And there's nothing like a fresh cucumber from my papa's garden. Every summer, my dear would have a big bag of strawberries waiting for me in her deep freezer. She and a neighbor grew them on the land next to her house. My father-in-law was an avid gardener, just like his father and father before him. He recently passed away, but before he did, he came to our house and we just stood outside and he gave me advice on where I should start my own garden. And we had plans to break ground together. And at my father-in-law's funeral, my husband remembered his father as someone who loved working the land. As he was always so generous with his harvest, and he showed his love by sharing vegetables from his garden with those who he loved. And so this connection to the land is in my blood. Leah Pennington helped found the Soul Fire Farm. It's a BIPOC-centered community farm in New York that is dedicated to ending racism and injustice in the food system. And she spoke about the connection that she has always had with the land. And she remembers feeling a sense of belonging, being out in nature, and restoration from her connection with the land. And I think about that and trying to rebuild that. And so my hope is to continue this legacy with my own son. So this is my son. He loves all of our plants and digging up the weeds from our garden. Right now we're working on having him not eat the dirt. But my dream is for him to also find strength and restoration from the land. And so I just want to end, with sharing, honoring, and giving credit to the work and knowledge of the Black women scholars, writers, and activists that I drew heavily on in this presentation and whose work I just so admire. So a very dear friend of mine, the brilliant scholar, Dr. Dee Hall, she's pictured here. She's an assistant professor of social studies at Georgia Southern. She introduced me to the work of Dr. McKittrick and her book, Demonic Grounds, and just completely blew my mind. And this is something that we've been talking about and that we're continuing to work on. So I'm very grateful for her for introducing me to this book, but also this idea of Black women's geography. I also referenced the work of the brilliant Keisha Blaine in her book on Fannie Lou Hamer. I definitely recommend that. Monica White wrote a wonderful book on agricultural resistance during the Black Freedom Movement. A Black Women's History of the United States by Dinah Ramey Berry and Callie Nicole Gross is another must read. I'm inspired by the work of Leah Penniman at Soul Fire Farms in New York. And of course, I can go on and on and on. But again, I just want to highlight and thank these women for their work. And that's it from me. I mean, thank you again for your time, to Dr. King and everyone at the Center for K-12 Black History and Racial Literacy Education at the University of Buffalo. It's been an honor and a joy to share virtual space with you this morning. And so with that, I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Amanda, so much.
Thank you.
If y'all have any questions for Amanda, you can either put them in the chat and Montana and I can ask your question from there, or you can unmute yourself and ask Amanda directly.
Yeah, question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so my question was, how would you integrate this concept in classes? Because I was envisioning something when I start I'm a global history teacher. So at the beginning of year, just, introducing this as a form of just how you were saying, breaking up that idea of geography. Do you think that would be a good point to start using it?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I think that's a great way to do it. I love to think about, so when I with my pre-service teachers, the way I have them, I usually introduce my geography section is having them kind of do a brain dump of what do they already know about geography. So having students, what is their existing knowledge? Because we know that students come to the classroom with knowledge of geography, about social studies, and just kind of see where their mind is. So a lot of times it's going to be physical geography, latitude, longitude, the equator, things like that. But then having them think about their own connections to geography. So looking at the difference between physical geography, human geography. And then I like to do, I think Dr. King mentioned earlier, I can't remember, it was this conversation or a conversation we had earlier about the movie Mean Girls with, Lindsay Lohan. There's a scene in there where she gets to the school and they're walking through the cafeteria and they're pointing out, Janice Ian is pointing out the different cliques. And so that's a really interesting way of thinking about geography and your connection to a space. Sandra Schmidt is a scholar at Teachers College, and she kind of did this study with high schoolers and thinking about queer geography and how we queer spaces and how students make sense of these spaces. And so then I like to think about my students' connections in thinking about maps and how there's so much power in creating these maps and how historically those in positions of power have dictated how big things are, how small things are, how things appear, what's centered. That's based on, like I said, this kind of Western way of thinking about mapping. So I kind of then explore mapping in that way. There's a great Vox video that kind of debunks all these myths about how all of our maps are wrong. And then thinking about how students create their own maps of the school. With young kids, I'd like to have them create maps of their classroom, because it's really interesting in thinking about students' connections to their own space. And so thinking about like, okay, if I'm in my classroom, why did I center the dramatic play area? Why is the kitchen center really, really small? Well, was there an incident there that made me not want to like that space? Having students think about how they're seeing and making sense of their own space. That's one way I like to kind of shift the way of people think about geography. And then you can think about teaching in a way where, like I said, instead of, you can still teach the 5 themes of geography, but then having them think about space, place identity. And that might be a lens in which for students to think about geography. So yeah, I'm hoping that somewhat answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Right, Amanda, I do have a question from the chat. As you were talking about Black people needing a home, place, land, and freedom, is it appropriate to teach Marcus Garvey in lessons on geography and Black space as context for particular people like Hamer and her belief that land is necessary?
I mean, I think you could absolutely do that. I mean, I don't think Fannie Lou Hamer is the only one to do it. I think there's this long line of Black people talking about, their connection with the land and having a land of their own. I also think about, Malcolm X talked about, food, how food is has been used as a political weapon as well. So yeah, I think it's totally appropriate to trace this kind of long lineage of Black people talking about the importance of having a place, and thinking about colonialism and things like that. So absolutely.
Any other questions? I know someone wants to know if you're on social media.
I am no longer on Twitter, unfortunately, but I am on Instagram. But it's mainly, you'll see pictures of my dog. And then I post a lot of cooking videos and like a lot of cooking videos because I love food and eating. But yes, I am on Instagram. I think my tag is Mandy Moon Pie, something like that. But you can always email me if you have questions or ideas, or you want to chat more.
Go ahead.
I want to thank you because I remember, well, I'm almost 75. I remember when I was younger going to my grandmother's farm and the cows and the smokehouse and the land. And I watched little by little how they stole her land from her. And now her family, me, a descendant, is living in an apartment. But every place you look, there's a plant because that desire for going back to the land is still in us and will never leave us if we don't allow it to. So thank you so much for your presentation.
No, thank you for sharing that. And I think it's important for us to share those stories because so many of us have those connections, but also they have impacted, us in different ways. My mother, she always talks about her experiences visiting her grandmother's, farm. And that related to, she would always drag me out there and we had our little garden at home, or we were always, in the soil, touching the soil. I mean, those things live with us. And this idea of passing that on to the new generation. And there's so many, young organizations, nonprofits of Black farmers trying to, encourage to continue this legacy. So I think it's so important to just share those stories and to make that as part of our curriculum, incorporate that as part of our curriculum. So thank you for sharing that.
We have time for one more question. If anyone wants to unmute and ask.
I do want to shout out, I do see my friend Dee Hall is here. So again, I just want to shout out, highlight her and the brilliant work that she does. Hey Dee, at Georgia Southern. She was the one who introduced me to this book and this work and Black women's geography. So stay tuned. I definitely recommend you follow her. I know that she is very active on social media. And this is, like I said, continuing a line. That's something that she invited me to work on this work with her. So I would definitely shout out and follow her on social media.
All right, I did drop the link in the chat so you can join us next week to hear from my good sis Brittany at our next Black History Nerds Saturday School. Thank y'all again for coming, and we hope to see y'all next week. Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all. Happy Saturday.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
Thank you.